Yesterday, on Fox News, Giuliani was pressed on whether it was appropriate for President Trump to press Ukraine to investigate the former vice president and his son.
Do you know when I found out about Joe Biden? Do you know what I told my colleague? They're going to cover this up. Too bad Biden's involved in this. I got a nice straight case of Ukrainian collusion. The minute I say Biden, that Washington press corps is going to go nuts. They've been covering up for years. China, plagiarism.
Now you're straying into areas of opinion.
I'm straying into what is wrong with us today.
We need to point out. We need to point out that Yuri Lutsenko, who was the prosecutor who was appointed after Shokin was fired, resurrected, reanimated the case, and found that Hunter Biden was in fact paid millions of dollars. But Lutsenko said that the board of Burisma was able to pay a board member whatever they wanted, and he didn't see anything wrong with that.
Distorted.
I'm just pointing out a fact.
If you did any work, you'd find out Lutsenko is the prosecutor that Biden put in.
One other point we need to make here.
I won't answer another question unless you be finished. This is really unfair. These are very important things that have been covered up for years to protect Slimy Joe.
You know, so here we are, Richard Haas. You actually have Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal putting out a fact check that shows that everything Rudy Giuliani is saying is a lie. And then you have Fox News, Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, showing that what Rudy Giuliani is saying is a lie. Is Richard Haas there? I'm just curious.
Yes.
He's here.
Good. I just want to see him while I'm talking to him. And so
he looks great.
So you have Fox News. He does look great. Fox News and the Wall Street Journal saying that everything that was that Rudy Giuliani is claiming is a lie. John Roberts even started smirking at Fox News because it was so embarrassing how much Rudy Giuliani was making a fool of himself. And so Giuliani's only response at the end was to call him Slimy Joe, because he was making such an ass of himself. So it's very telling that you have the Wall Street Journal and Fox News calling out these lies. And you were actually there when Biden was at the Council on Foreign Relations explaining how the entire Western world was saying this prosecutor had to get fired because nobody was going to loan Ukraine money if they didn't start cleaning up corruption. Explain that.
Exactly. This prosecutor was part of a much larger problem. Under the previous regime, when Poroshenko was president, Ukraine was notorious for there was systematic institutional corruption. They refused to create an independent anti-corruption court, and the prosecutors they did have were either too weak or worse yet, were part of the problem, as this one individual was. So the arguments that the United States had in the past under the Obama administration were totally legitimate. And we were not alone. It wasn't as though it was a unilateral American problem with Ukraine. It was the IMF. It was all the Europeans. It made it impossible to help Ukraine, and everybody wanted to help Ukraine in order to push back against Putin and Russia. So again, the U.S. policy was totally consistent with the rest of the world at the time, Joe.
And so what, Jonathan Lemire, the president obviously has felt under siege, especially since Friday. And he has the Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal, breaking the news that 8 times he pressured the president of Ukraine 8 times to work with his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, on digging up dirt on his domestic rival. And then you have Fox News yesterday calling out Rudy Giuliani, who the poor guy is left with just making up like 5th grade names to try to attack Joe Biden. Where has the White House been this weekend, especially White House insiders, on handling a scandal that they know actually is going to cause the president real political pain?
Well, first, I think the framing you used earlier is right. This is a president who has suffered very few consequences and paid no penalty for his actions. I think the timing of that phone call with the new Ukrainian president is illuminating. It was this past July. It was one day after Robert Mueller's appearance before Congress and his somewhat faltering testimony about the Russia investigation. And the president survived that probe with far less damage than I think most people predicted. And there was a sense around him that he was emboldened, that he could do whatever he wanted. And in this matter, he pressed Ukraine for help against Joe Biden. The very thing that he was investigated before with Russia, the idea of seeking or receiving foreign help in an election, it seemed like he was doing again. There is a sense of some concern in the White House. The president himself has downplayed it. He suggested yesterday he sparred with reporters on Friday, again over the weekend, yesterday in Texas, mused that he might even put out the transcript at some point that would clear his name. He has told people around him he does not think he has done anything wrong, and that therefore he thinks this is more of a matter of another sort of deep state whistleblower, partisan whistleblower, trying to undermine him. But there is people around him, though, there is a degree of worry that this is something that could lead to real problem. We are seeing rising calls for impeachment in the House. You know, Adam Schiff is suddenly moving that direction. Speaker Pelosi, not yet. But what happened, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, took to Twitter to blast the leadership over the weekend, saying, why are we not moving to impeach here? So there is some growing momentum there. There is concern among the White House. And now, as the president comes here to New York, to the United Nations, this conversation, the matter with Ukraine, is going to provide a backdrop to the entire week.
Right. Of course, there's no press secretary to speak of, so it's hard to get, any type of formal statement about this. But when it comes to Trump, there's always Mnuchin. Here's Steve Mnuchin.
What I do find is inappropriate is the fact that Vice President Biden at the time's son did very significant business dealings in Ukraine. I, for one, find that to be concerning. And to me, that's the issue perhaps that should be further investigated.
Well, I don't understand. So it's okay for Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump to do business all over the world. It's okay for Ivanka Trump to have copyrights approved all over the world while President Trump is president. But while Vice President Biden was vice president, his son shouldn't have been able to do business dealings?
Again, I don't really want to go into more of these details other than to say...
Well, you're just setting a precedent that the president is violating.
Again, I think there's a significant difference in what you're saying, okay, or what I was saying, between Biden and his son's relationship with the Ukraine oligarch and potential business dealings that the Trump organization has had, which predated his presidency.
That's really, Mika.
Steve's in deep.
You have Rudy Giuliani making a fool of himself on Fox News, and then Mnuchin doing the same on CNN, and you have Donald Trump doing what Donald Trump does all the time. He admits the scandal in broad daylight. And because he admits the scandal in broad daylight, instead of having it dug up, he thinks that makes everything okay. It does not, and this is unprecedented. Having the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, using his position to have a foreign power try to dig up dirt on an American domestic rival. It is a continued blurring of the lines from 2016, and it is un-American.
So, Michael Steele, is this the line for Republicans?
No. Not if John Cornyn's response to this was any indication.
What's it going to be? What's it going to take?
Well, I don't know at this point. I mean, Senator Cornyn came out and said, well, I find all of this to be very troubling about Joe Biden, and, started the typical Washington backstroke of we need to get more information. I serve on Senate Intelligence, and I'm sure we'll find out whatever, without having any, initial visceral reaction to what the Wall Street Journal's reporting, what you've opened this show about detailing, what the evidence displays. And then you have, Giuliani and Mnuchin going on television being actually laughable in their response. But that's the point. It is not supposed to clarify. It's not supposed to give you a straight line argument that this is not bad or there is no problem. It is to create the level of confusion. Joe, you have it exactly right. The president comes out and tells you, yeah, I did it. So what? And so as you started the show talking about and reading reports about there are no consequences, that's the world in which Donald Trump thrives, because there have been no consequences. So it's now a matter on something so important as this, whether or not the country is willing to make the president pay a consequence for behavior that leads to real questions about impeachment. And I think that this is something over the next 24 hours or more we're going to have to figure out, as the members on the Hill get microphones put in front of their faces, to see whether or not they're willing to hold the president to a standard that we've held every president who's had the job before.
Well, and John Mnuchin, what great illumination we have into the soul, not of America, but the soul of the Republican Party. You have one Republican after another trying to brush aside the fact that their president, the commander-in-chief, spoke to a foreign leader 8 times and intimidated him 8 times to use his personal lawyer to dig up dirt in a foreign country against a domestic rival. 8 times. Mitt Romney even came out. It's surreal. All of it is so surreal, and all of it eventually will damage the Republican Party in next year's election. But Mitt Romney said, well, if Donald Trump actually did speak to a foreign power to have them dig up dirt, that would be very troubling. The Wall Street Journal reported even before that tweet that it happened 8 times, and Donald Trump admitted that he did it. And yet they decide to live in this never land.
That's a great way to put it. It is never land. And, you know, history, there's no once upon a time. There's not going to be a happily ever after. But there can be actual moments where we face facts. Eleanor Roosevelt said that's the test of a great government, a great society, is can you, in fact, face facts, however uncomfortable they are. And what I think is the great story of our time, honestly, is the extent to which 45% of the country, many of them Republicans, have suspended their critical capacities, have suspended their essential, dare I say it, patriotic instincts to follow this particular leader because of the will to power. So we're the party of Eisenhower, Reagan, Bush are comfortable with a president who conspires, who colludes, whatever you want to use, whatever word you want to use, with foreign leaders to affect our democracy. How do you square that?
Well, he said he would. He told George Stephanopoulos he would do this.
Yeah, again,
no Republican really stepped out.
All in broad daylight. No Republican complained when Donald Trump told George Stephanopoulos that he would work, that he would collude with foreign powers to try to get dirt on his rival. And here, another good word for you, extort.
Yeah.
In this case, there are reports that he actually was extorting the democratically elected president of Ukraine, who had already seen his country invaded by Vladimir Putin. And there are reports that he extorted him, saying that he was not going to get military weapons unless he dug up dirt, cooperated with his personal lawyer to dig up dirt on his domestic political rival.
One of the things that's happened here, I've been thinking about this all weekend, is there are a couple of really interesting entries in George H.W. Bush's papers through the years. One was where he confronted the John Birch Society back in the Harris County in Houston in the mid-1960s. And he's looking at these folks, and he says, you know, their eyes aren't focused. You know, they're living according to a narrative in their heads that does not actually track with reality. And he saw a little bit later some in the 80s. And I think that's just, it's gone from being a fringe, the Birch Society, which is what Richard Hofstadter was writing about when he defined the paranoid style in American politics. It was for that moment, that was the occasion for that essay. But the paranoid style has gone mainstream. And I think one of the great questions of the era is going to be, who wants to be Margaret Chase Smith? Who wants to be Joseph Welch, the lawyer who said to McCarthy, finally, have you no decency? And I promise you, there's a historical legacy, there's a historical halo ready to be grabbed if people will stand up and say, no more.
Yeah, but you know, Mika, there is, as John said, there is a suspension of belief. And we've seen it even with some of our friends who will talk about how many miles of the wall Donald Trump has built, when Donald Trump's own administration when the statistics in Donald Trump's own administration show that 0 miles of new wall have been built, but you can't tell them because there's a suspension of belief. Because in speeches, Donald Trump says, "Oh, we're building this wall so quickly," but and here you have a suspension of belief that somehow it's okay that 8 times the President of the United States pressured a foreign leader to dig up dirt on his political opponent in the United States.
I think it's different this time, and here's why. First of all, if you say, to a Trump supporter, a Republican who's serving, President Trump told George Stephanopoulos that he would work with a foreign leader to dig up dirt on an enemy, political enemy, that person would say, he doesn't mean it. He just says that. He doesn't mean it. Well, guess what? It appears that he does mean it. But when the information comes out, I don't know if the whistleblower is going to have to step out on his or her own, or if this information will come. Right now, this information is being covered up. But at some point, if and when the information comes out, I think Republicans will be in a very different position. They will not be able to say, well, he doesn't mean it, which is what they usually say to protect him. Up next, we're going to, Adrien Elrod, I do want to ask you, what is the risk and the gain for the Biden campaign?
Well, I guess to an extent, Mika, anytime Hunter Biden's past dealings in Ukraine are making the news because of this situation, that's not a great place for the Biden campaign to do or to be, even though obviously Hunter Biden did nothing wrong. That's been investigated. That's been made clear that he did nothing wrong. But I think the gains are far outweigh the cons here. I mean, Joe Biden can now go out there and say the president of the United States is trying to pressure an ally to get information, to get opposition research, to get dirt on me and my family. I mean, that's something you can take out there to voters and really, make it clear how disdainful this is and what a gross abuse of power this is. So I think ultimately the pros in this situation far outweigh the cons.
And again, it is. You talk about Americans hating politics. Yeah. You talk about an inside game, rigging the process, and we've talked about how Donald Trump is rigging the process on the Republican side to make sure that as many states as possible cancel Democratic elections in the primary. I mean, he's learned from Vladimir Putin the way you get 100% of the vote is you just cancel the elections. And that's what Donald Trump is getting Republican operatives to do across the country. So he's rigging the election that way. He's using his power now to try to rig the election. So a foreign power is pressured to actually try to dig up dirt on Joe Biden and his family, and is, to use the word that Rudy Giuliani used, in actions that most voters would consider to be very slimy, especially since every investigation has shown that Joe Biden not only acted properly, but did what democracies across the West were asking him to do, and that is clean up Ukraine by getting rid of a corrupt investigator.
And politically, this is losing ugly for the Trump campaign. Everybody who knows Joe Biden and supports Joe Biden will dig in deeper. They will be deeply, deeply, deeply concerned and upset about what Trump is doing to the Biden family. You have Joe Biden, who lost his daughter and wife in a car accident and then lost Beau Biden to brain cancer. This is Joe Biden's surviving son. This politically is losing very ugly for the Trump campaign. That's just the bottom line.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.